do worry that if we're going to end up in stagflation, it could end up being worse than the one that we had in the 1970s. That's why I worry that we are at the end of the great moderation where we had low inflation and stable growth, and we're at the beginning of what I call a stagflationary debt crisis. You know, as they say, you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all the time.
네, 전 세계의 현명한 구루들을 찾아서 그들의 의견을 들어보고 또 그들의 이야기에서 인사이트를 함께 찾아보는 세상 유익한 인터뷰 프로그램 글로벌머니토크입니다. 오늘도 중앙일보의 강남규 선임기자와 함께 또 엄청난 인터뷰를 시작하게 되지 않겠습니까? 어서 오십시오.
안녕하세요. 강남규입니다.
네, 오늘 인터뷰는 바로 이분입니다.
그죠. 닥터 둠.
누리엘 루비니. 누리엘 루비니. 이분은 글로벌 금융 위기를 2008년에 예견한 것으로 유명하다는
그쵸.
걸로 봐서 이분은 비관론에 가까운 의견을 주로 자주 표명하는 분인가 보네요.
주로 비관론이죠. 그러니까 루비니는 여러분들이 뭐 굳이 설명하지 않아도 지금 현재 뉴욕대학교에 사실은 은퇴를 했는데 명예교수 그 에머리토스로 있는데요. 그리고 루비니 매크로 어소시어츠라 그래가지고 회사를 하나 운영하고 시작했어요. 그래서 이제 강연도 하고 자기가 컨설팅도 하고 그 다음에 여러 가지 자기 유명세로 이제 독자적인 비즈니스를 하고 있는데 이번에 메가 스트레트 한국어 번역으로는 초거대 위협 듣기만 해도 사실 음울하지 않습니까? 그래서 그 우리 삼프로의 루비니는 이제 우리 글로벌머니토크가 나름대로 이제 이 구독자분들의 사랑을 받다 보니까 이 삼프로로 이 출연을 좀 섭외를 해왔어요. 출판사에서. 네. 그래서 사실 그 뭐 어레인지하고 실무는 제가 했지만은 그 삼프로에게 덕분에 루비니하고 직접 주문을
지금까지는 강남규 기자님이 항상
대부분 이제
이메일로 오퍼를 하고
전문용어로 제가 찍사였는데
처음으로
아니
인바운드 콜이 들어왔다.
인바운드 콜로 몇 번 들어온 게 있습니다. 여러분들 네. 꽤나 유명한 분들 그동안 인터뷰할 때 3프로 직접 들어와 있는
알겠습니다.
어레인지가 의뢰가 들어왔습니다.
시청자 여러분들이야 그게 인바운드면 어떻고 아웃바운드면 어떠냐
그렇죠.
생각하시겠으나 저희에게는 그게 되게 중요합니다.
중요하죠. 그래서 덕분에 3프로 덕분에 사실 제가 그 루비니하고 직접 얼굴을 마주하진 않았지만 줌을 통해서 인터뷰를 하게 됐고요. 그 다음에 결정적으로 사실 그 내심 우리 기자들이 인터뷰를 오케이 할 때에 책을 쓰거나 그랬을 때 책 내용을 소개시켜주겠다. 이거는 이제 명분이지 않습니까? 사실 우리 그 묻고 싶은 얘기는 따로 정해놓고
그럼요.
그렇죠.
책을 빙자한
이번에도 사실은 루비니 교수께서는 자꾸 그 위기를 세일즈하면서 먹고 사는 거 아닌가라는 그 의구심 이것을 사실은 내심 묻고 싶은 질문입니다. 앞으로 이제 그걸 이제 차근차근 물어나갈 텐데.
자. 그렇게 해서 그런 질문을 좀 해야 되겠다 이 말씀이죠.
근데 우선 책 얘기부터
그러시죠.
책 얘기부터 시작을 하죠.
요 책은 최근에 나온 책이 번역된 건가요?
지난해 미국에서 이제 거의 미국과 한국 시간차가 몇 개월 차이 안 나왔더라고요.
초거대 위협, 메가 스트레트.
그래서 참 말도 잘 만듭니다. 퍼펙트 스톰을 얘기했고 메가 스트레트를 얘기를 했고 그다음 2008년도에는 금융 시스템이 멜트다운 할 거다. 가장 무서운 거죠. 원자로가 녹아내리는 현상. 그와 같은 경우를 빗대서 말을 했는데 역시 위기를 세일즈해서 사는 것 같아요. 그 점을
그렇게 느끼셨어요?
꼭 인터뷰 말미에 물어보겠습니다.
자, 그럼 인터뷰를 시작해 보죠.
교수님 인터뷰 응해 주셔서 감사합니다. 사실 그 이번에 내신 책이 한 5번째 책으로 제가 알고 있습니다. 그 주로 이제 학술 서적을 많이 쓰셨는데 이번에는 어떤 개인의 그 저술의 역사에서 어떤 의미를 갖고 있다고 할 수 있을까요?
Yeah, and I also focus not only on trying to figure out how the world is going to be over the medium long term, but also in addition to the economic, monetary, and financial risks, and those risks are new compared to a few years ago, I So consider a number of social, political, geopolitical, environmental, health, and also technological kind of risks, and how they're all connected with the economic ones. I would also say that, while the book is about the next 10 to 20 years, and those are the threats, economic and non-economic ones, each one of these mega threats is already materializing today. I can give you, say, several examples of how those types of threats already are material today. So this is not only about how things could materialize 10 or 20 years from now, but many of these mega threats are current, and they're going to get worse over time, but they are not just about the future. And also, feedback that I've gotten is that, I'm talking about threats that everybody recognizes exist. I'm not talking about the risk of aliens taking over the planet or an asteroid hitting the planet. I'm talking about things that everybody, to some degree, recognizes. And of course, different people have different views on how severe some of these threats are and over which horizon, and whether the policy solution to them are viable or not viable. But I don't think anybody could deny they exist, and they also interact with each other as well. I would say that actually, while I'm using the term mega threats, one of the words of the year, according to the Financial Times, was the term poly crisis. There's the same idea that there are economic and non-economic risks and threats that are imperiling our future. I was on stage in December at the IMF presenting my book and debating it with the head of the IMF, Miss Kristalina Georgieva. She wrote a speech where she speaks about the confluence of calamities like we haven't seen since World War II. And I was just recently also in Davos for the World Economic Forum, and the WEF published that week their global risk report. An entire global risk report was, again, about threats, risks, and polycrises, where the connection between economic and non-economic ones is relevant. And they said that we're going to face the most turbulent decade to come. So whether you call them mega threats, or whether you call it polycrises, or whether you call it a confluence of calamities, or the most dangerous, turbulent decade to come, I think that different people actually are speaking about the same stuff. I've done so much more explicitly, not just by writing a blog or a speech, but an entire book about it. But I think there is a consensus. These are serious things that are really not only threatening our economic and financial future, the future of our jobs, income, and saving and wealth. They can threaten the planet, and they can threaten also the survival of our species as human on this planet, because some of these mega threats could actually destroy the human species. Nuclear winter from war among great powers, global climate change, a more virulent pandemic, and eventually even AI. According to some AI scientists, could even, make Homo sapiens, our species, obsolete. So these are serious things.
그 루비니 교수 말대로 그동안은 사실은 단기적이고 눈앞의 문제를 분석하거나 아니면 이론적인 모델을 구축하는 데 이 책을 썼다라면은 이번은 장기적이고 비경제적인 요인까지 한꺼번에 작용하는 통섭을 바탕으로 그 미래 전망을 했다라고 얘기를 하십니다.
통섭.
예. 다양한 비경제적인 요인, 인구의 문제, 물론 인구의 문제도 경제적인 문제입니다만은 그 다음에 그 지정학적인 문제 이런 것까지도 미래의 앞으로 10년 장기적으로 10년 중장기적으로 10년의 기간 동안에 어떻게 이 글로벌 경제에 영향을 주는가 그것을. 근데 나이 들면은 지금 60대에 접어들었거든요. 2008년도에 금융위기를 그 예측했을 때는 굉장히 젊은 시절에 소장파였습니다.
그러네요.
예.
저보다 어린 나이에 금융위기를 예언했어요.
그렇죠. 그러면서 이제 유명해졌기 때문에 이제는 좀 그 뭐랄까 거시적이고 큰 틀의 얘기를 좀
하고 싶을 나이죠.
나이가 됐겠죠.
알겠습니다.
그렇습니다.
예, 교수님, 책을 보니까 부채 위기에 대해서 깊이 다루셨던데, 뭐 많은 분들이 부채를 우리의 골칫거리로 주목하고 있기는 합니다만, 부채 위기에 주목을 한 특별한 이유나 계기가 있으셨습니까?
In the book, I have the first 3 chapters about a variety of debt crises, and the first chapter talks about the mother of all debt crises. I point out that both private debt, the debt of households, of businesses and corporations, of financial institutions, and the debt of governments, central government, state and local, as a share of GDP has been exploding from about 100% of GDP in the 70s to 200% of GDP in 1999 to last year 350% of GDP and rising. And in the case of the public debt, and that's the subject matter of chapter 3, I also point out that in addition to the explicit debt, the bonded debt of governments, there is also implicit debt that is coming from aging of population and the unfunded liabilities coming from either pension system or healthcare for the elderly. That is usually a pay-as-you-go system where payroll taxes of the young pay for the benefits of the old. And as we have aging and we have less young and more old people, that's an implicit debt. An implicit debt is estimated for advanced economies to be at least 100% of GDP, so as high as explicit debt. I also point out that, while debt ratios were very high, private and public, until recently, debt servicing ratio until 2 years ago were low. We had zero policy rates, negative policy rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, and until 2 years ago, $18 trillion equivalent of public debt between Europe and Japan had the interest rates that in nominal term was negative in nominal term. So while debt ratios were high, debt servicing ratio, the interest payment on those debts were low. Things have changed in the last couple of years because, of course, as we know, inflation has been rising, certainly in almost all advanced economies, with the exception maybe of Japan, and in a number of emerging markets, not all of them, but, even in emerging markets, some of them ended up with high inflation, if not double-digit inflation. And therefore, central banks had to increase interest rates to start to fight inflation. So short rates have gone higher, policy rates have gone higher, and of course, long-term interest rates have gone higher. And therefore, debt servicing ratios are now rising. So what households pay on mortgages, on student loans, on auto loans, on personal loans, on credit cards, what businesses pay on their bank loans or corporation or on their bonds, or financial institution will borrow on the cost of liabilities. And of course, what government pay, interest rates on their debt is rising. And of course, while you cannot generalize, you have to look at each country, sector by sector, private and public, domestic, foreign debt. Overall, with debt ratios that are now 4 times as high as the 70s, and now debt servicing ratio rising, those institutions, private and public, in advanced economies or emerging markets that have too much debt, are going to face debt servicing problems. And I believe that inflation is going to be high for the long term, and therefore interest rates are going to remain high and much higher, both in nominal and real terms than the past. That's the risk of debt crisis. And of course, aging of population is not just US, Europe, Japan, it's also China, it's South Korea, it's Taiwan, it's Russia, number of other emerging markets, not all of them, of course. India is still young and population is rising, but many others, especially those that are higher income in Asia, are starting to see decline in population. So that's going to create also these implicit liabilities that are going to become over time a source of concern. Yeah.
네, 정말 그 mother of all crisis.
항상 부채가 문제죠.
그렇죠.
네.
부채가 문제죠. 근데 여기서 말하는 부채, 그 로비니 교수가 말하는 부채에서 좀 우리 그 구독자분들께서 이해하셔야 될 게 단순한 지급 의무 있지 않습니까? 젊은 세대들이 감당해야 될 고령화 때문에 감당해야 될 노인들을 위한 복지 비용 이런 까지는 이제 부채에 넣은 거죠. 그래서 폭넓은 지급 의무를 이제 모두 부채로 받고요. 사실 그 IMF나 아니면은 그 세계 채권은행, 그러니까 거대 투자은행이나 시중은행의 그 이익 단체죠. 그 글로벌 금융협회 그쪽에서 보면은 지금 지난 2020년, 21년 말이죠. 22년 초 그쯤에 글로벌 부채가 단순 집계한 글로벌 부채가 300조 달러를 넘었더라고요. 어마무시한 거죠.
그게 결국은 그냥 풀려 있는 돈과 비슷한 거 아닙니까? 부채라고 하는 게?
그렇죠. 그 이제 현대 통화 시스템에서 보면은 부채를 통해서 결국 머니 크리에이션이 발생하기 때문에
세상에 풀려 있는 돈이
네,
결국은
그렇죠.
누군가의 자산이면서 누군가에는 부채고.
부채죠.
세상의 모든 부채야 다 사라져라라고 하면 부채가 사라지는 아름다운 세상이 되는데.
근데 머니 크리에이션
돈이 왜 하나도 없어졌냐?
신용 창출도 안 되는 거죠.
그렇죠. 돈도 없어졌어? 뭐 이렇게 되는.
예.
참 그래서 그게 참 골치 아프다고들 하죠.
예. 자 그렇다면 교수님 그 지금 말씀을 듣다 보니까 폭넓게 정의한 부채가 눈덩이처럼 불어나 있는데 마음이 좀 답답해지네요. 어디 뭐 탈출구는 좀 엿보이는 편입니까? 어떻습니까?
The solutions, I mean, whenever you have too much debt, you have to find ways of transferring wealth and income from savers and creditors to borrowers and debtors in order to make those debt ratios lower, more sustainable. If you are in an emerging market economy that borrows mostly in foreign currency, you cannot wipe out the real value of your debt with inflation or a devaluation because most of your debt is in foreign currency and therefore the debasement of your currency increases actually the real value in local currency of your foreign currency debt. That's what happened in Asia in 97, 98, Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, that the currency crisis and the real value of their foreign currency debt ballooned. So if you're an emerging market and you have a debt problem, if you borrow a lot in foreign currency, you have no option but effectively defaulting or under threat of default, restructure in a coercive way. And I wrote a whole book in 2005 on bailouts and bail-ins in emerging market crisis. If you are, however, in advanced economies that borrows in your own currency, you don't necessarily, at least as a government, need to default because unexpected inflation can reduce the real value of nominal long duration debt at fixed interest rates. That's exactly what happened last year. Last year, actually, debt ratio in advanced economies started to fall because we had unexpected inflation, say around 10% approximately. And therefore, some debt ratio were reduced by this unexpected inflation. The point, however, I make in the book is that for a while, you can play this game, but you have two problems. One, if you blink and wimp out and you monetize these debts and use the inflation tax, eventually you have a de-anchoring of inflation expectations, like the 70s. You can have a wage price spiral, and then you end up like at the 70s with high inflation, double digits on a persistent basis. Problem number one. Problem number two of using the inflation tax as opposed to other means to reduce this debt ratio is that, as they say, you can fool all of the people some of the time, some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all the time. So you postpone a debt crisis for a little while because you wipe out some debt, but unless you go to really high debt, high inflation or hyperinflation, and I do not expect that advanced economy are going to end up like Argentina in 1990 or other episodes of hyperinflation, then 5-6% inflation, even 10, can help you for 2 or 3 years. But once things reprice, then your debt dynamic becomes like before with higher nominal and real rates as I'll say unsustainable as before. So inflation tax can help you for a little while, but unless it's very high and unexpected rising inflation, it doesn't resolve the debt problem. It pushes it down the line by 2 or 3 years, and then you still end up, especially in the private sector, where the credit spreads can widen when debt ratios are high, inflation is high. Then you end up into a debt crisis, regardless of.
뭐 빠져나갈 거면 일시적으로 그러니까 우리 바이마르 공화국이 했던 것처럼 1920년대에 엄청난 통화정부 종이돈을 찍어내서 그 채무의 실질적인 부담을 줄이는 방법. 그건 뭐 2, 3년 갈 수는 있지만 오래 갈 수는 없고요.
네.
그 점을 말씀하시고요. 그 앞으로 10년 정도에는 그 이 눈덩이처럼 불어난 부채 때문에 이 물가 상승률이 상당히 그 높은 상태에서 유지될 가능성, 그것을 말씀하셨습니다.
예, 바로 그 질문을 좀 계속 드리죠. 교수님, 이 책에 보면 그 스태그플레이션, 그러니까 물가가 오르면서 경기는 침체되는 스태그플레이션 중에서도 특히 심각해서 그렇게 이름을 붙이셨는지 모르겠는데 그레이트 스태그플레이션이라는 용어를 쓰셨더군요. 앞으로 발생할 스태그플레이션이 그 정도가 매우 강할 것이다, 그렇게 예상한 표현이라고 이해해도 되겠습니까?
Yeah, no, I call it because I do worry that if we're going to end up in stagflation, it could end up being worse than the one that we had in the 1970s. You know, the stagflation in the 1970s was only driven by 2 negative aggregate supply shocks that spiked all prices. First one being the Yom Kippur War between Israel and the Arab states in 73 that led to an oil embargo, tripling of oil prices, and the second one by the shock to the production of Iranian oil coming from the Islamic Revolution 1979. But those were, you know, oil shock and just oil, not even all of energy. And they led to, you know, between 1973 to 1982 to a decade of stagflation, of significantly high inflation and 2 severe recessions, one in 74, 75, and another one in 80, 82. This time around, for the short run, of course, the reason why inflation has gone higher has been a combination of bad policy and bad luck. Bad policy being excessively loose monetary, fiscal, and credit easing after the COVID shock. Yes, we needed easing, but we did it for too much, too long. I think that that's agreed that, you know, given the extent of the shock that was temporary, the amount of stimulus was too much. Bad luck was the fact that there were 3 negative aggregate supply shocks, quite persistent. One was the initial impact of COVID on production and goods and services, on the supply of labor, and on global supply chains. The second one was the implication of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine on commodity prices, oil, natural gas, fertilizer, foods, industrial metal. And third one was, until recently, the zero COVID policy of China that created new production bottlenecks and supply chain bottlenecks. But the point I make in the book is that even if some of these negative aggregate supply shocks were to ease, and some of them are easing, you know, COVID now is going away, China is phasing out zero COVID policy. Unfortunately, the Russia-Ukraine war is not going away. It's going to get worse this year, and therefore that impact is going to stay. But even if eventually that war was to be over, in the book I identify at least 10 more medium long-term factors that are considered as aggregate negative supply shock that are stagflationary because they reduce potential growth, increase the cost of production, and if then you have loose monetary and fiscal policy, they lead to inflation and to recession, stagflation. You know, they're discussed in detail, of course, in chapter 5. If I had to summarize them now, one is deglobalization and protectionism. The second one, you know, the going from free trade to fair trade and secure trade. Second one is rather than offshoring to China, reshoring or friendshoring, you know, having just in case redundant supply chains as opposed to having just in time. And that's also going to be costly. 3, aging of population, both in advanced economies and key emerging markets. 4, restriction to migration from south to north, from poor to rich. In the past, that migration kept a lead on wage growth. 5, this geopolitical depression and the decoupling between US and China, but not just US and China. You know, you have at least 4 revisionist powers, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, that essentially challenge the economic, monetary, trade, financial, political, and geopolitical order than the US, Europe, the West, South Korea, and Japan and their friends and allies of the West in Asia around the world created after World War II. That's leading to fragmentation, decoupling, balkanization, division in the global economy. Additionally, of course, there's global climate change that through desertification causes higher food prices, that through underinvestment in fossil fuels leads to higher energy prices. We have, of course, pandemics. COVID-19 was a negative supply shock. This is not going to be the last one for reasons I discussed in the book. There'll be new ones, probably more virulent. We have also cyber warfare that damages production or it costs a lot of money to protect you. And there are 2 final factors. One is a backlash against income and wealth inequality, is leading to fiscal policies pro-labor, pro-union, pro-workers, pro-unemployed, pro-partially unemployed people. Rightly so, because otherwise you can have a social strife, but that's going to increase wage growth. And finally, we're weaponizing the dollar, the euro, and other major currency for foreign policy and national security purposes. Rightly so, because we want to deter initially Russia, but also China from becoming aggressive. But that weaponization could lead to a disorderly fall over time of the US dollar, and it creates frictions, sand in the wheels of the international payment system, payments for goods, services, movement of capital, labor, data, technology, information, and therefore those frictions, again, increase cost of production, and they're stagflationary. And these are all medium, long-term forces. Now, they're all occurring. They're slow motion. Not all of them are occurring fast, but these are 10 forces that are all stagflationary. In the past, there was one force that was deflationary in a good way, that was technology. Technology still could be deflationary over the medium long term. The impact of AI, robotic, automation, machine learning, quantum, eventually on the production of goods and services. But for whatever reason, we don't yet see the macro aggregate productivity numbers, the impact of all this is on productivity, probably because there is a lag between the innovation and application. But that's one force. We'll identify 10 forces that go in the other direction. They reduce the economic pie, reduce potential growth, increase cost of production, and then they become stagflationary. So that's why I worry that we are at the end of the great moderation, where we had low inflation and stable growth, and we're at the beginning of a what I call a stagflationary debt crisis, because not only you're going to have inflation, not only you're going to have recession and therefore stagflation, but as I discussed, given debt ratios and higher inflation and higher nominal and real rates, you're going to also have a debt crisis. That's why I call it that.
야,
참 사실 루비니 교수가 말했던 우리가 1970년대 후반에 경험했던 스태그플레이션은 그 두 차례 오일 쇼크 때문에 발생한 거거든요. 물론 그 이면에 또 지정학적인 갈등도 있고요. 네. 어떻게 보면 굉장히 단순한 요인 때문에 시작을 했는데 지금 그 우리가 마주할 물론 논쟁이 있을 겁니다. 그리고 이것은 논쟁이 분명히 있어야 되는 상황이고요. 그 루비니 교수가 말한 그레이트 스태그플레이션은 사실은 그 70년대보다 더 복잡한 요인, 지정학적인 갈등, 물론 그 신냉전이라고 부르는 거, 그 다음에 눈덩이처럼 불어난 빚, 기타 등등의 요인 때문에 더 많은 요인이 작용하고 있기 때문에 더 강한 스태그플레이션이 발생할 것이다. 더 심각한, 죄송합니다. 그래서 그레이트라고 그 수식어를 붙였다고 말씀하시네요.
그러니까 앞으로는 스태그플레이션, 물가는 오르면서 경기는 침체되는. 네. 사실은 가장 최악의 조합이 그거죠.
그죠.
차라리 물가라도 안정되면 돈이라도 풀 텐데 저성장이라도
예.
그것도 아니고 이걸 보면 저게 안 되고 저걸 보면 이게 답답한.
그래서 요즘 no landing 시나리오 이거 사실은 그 뭐 개념이 좀 불분명합니다만 신조어는 원래 새롭게 만들어진 경제 용어는
no landing
예.
시나리오가 있죠.
예, no landing 시나리오를 주장하는 분들, 그걸 믿는 분들과 그 다음에 이 그레이트 스태그플레이션 이 분명히 논쟁의 대상이 될 것 같아요. 이 부분은
둘 다 물가는 꽤 오를 거라는
그렇죠.
전제는 깔고 있으면서 no landing은 경기도 괜찮을 거요.
아, 그렇죠.
거고 그레이트 스태그플레이션이면 각오해라.
예.
그 이야기인데.
자, 그래서 교수님 그 그레이트 스태그플레이션이란 말을 쓰신 그것 자체가 사실 현재 페드 등 그 세계 주요 중앙은행들이 벌이고 있는 인플레이션 파이팅이 실패로 끝날 수밖에 없다라는 걸 전제하는 걸로 보입니다. 어떻습니까?
Well, the role of central banking, rather than on the supply side, comes on the demand side. I discussed the factors that are more negative aggregate supply shocks, stagflationary. But other points I make in the book and the chapter on stagflation is that, in my view, central banks who are claiming they're going to fight inflation at any cost and bring it back to 2%, they cannot do so. Not because they are stupid, not because they are evil, but because we live in what I call a debt trap. And the concept of a debt trap actually has been developed by the economists at the Bank for International Settlements, that is the central bank of all central banks in Basel, Switzerland. And they say that there is so much private and public debt in the system that if central banks were to increase interest rates enough to bring back inflation to 2%, not only you're going to get a hard landing of the real economy, a recession, but you also, because of the rise in debt servicing ratio, you're going to have a debt crisis with defaults in the private and public sector, and a more severe defaults and a financial crisis is going to make the recession, of course, worse. Credit crunch, like during the Asian financial crisis, where the collapse of banks and financial institutions and the debt defaults in the private sector led then to a more severe recession. Of course, when the recession is severe, income and output falls, your debt ratio become even more unsustainable. So a financial crash causes an economic crash. An economic crash makes the financial crash worse. So faced with an economic and financial crash, my view is central banks are going to, one, blink and wimp out. Two, if we cannot reduce taxes, increase taxes or cut government spending to make these debts and deficits sustainable, the path of least resistance is to wipe out, as I said, the real value of nominal long duration debt with unexpected inflation. That becomes the path of least resistance. So in a world in which there is too much debt, central banks are in a debt trap. Not only there is fiscal dominance rather than monetary dominance, but it's not just the game of chicken between a central bank and a fiscal authority. It's a game of chicken between a central bank and private and public debt that leads them then to essentially blink. They have no option. And by the way, the rise in debt itself is in part caused by the central bank behavior. It's not just that, of course, there are political factors while we borrow too much and we kick the can down the road. But every time there has been an asset and credit bubble, central banks were not willing to raise interest rates to try to prevent the bubble, the debt and credit bubble. So we've built up too much debt. And every time then there is a debt crisis, central banks say, oh my God, the financial system will collapse. The real economy is going to collapse, so we have to save the system. Then they ease aggressively, and therefore that aggressive easing and bailing out private and public debtors causes them again to borrow even more. So the reason why debt ratio have been rising is in part, not only, caused by central bank moral hazards. You know, in the US they used to call it the Greenspan put, the willingness of Greenspan to ease monetary policy to save the stock market. The Greenspan put became the Bernanke put. The Bernanke put became the Yellen put. Yellen put became the Powell put. But I would say there is a big central bank put of trying to bail the system out, incentivizing even more debt, leverage, and risk-taking. So it's not that it's not passively. They created in part this problem, and now that they've created this problem, they're in a debt trap. If they raise interest rates, they kill the economy and the financial system. Therefore, they will have to monetize it. Final point I think is important is the following one on the demand side. Economic historians like Neil Ferguson have shown that whenever there is a war, a real war, we spend more on defense. We cannot raise taxes during a war. We have bigger deficits. Then we monetize them and we get always inflation. So inflation is associated with wars. What I argue is that we're going to fight in the next decade or two 5 types of wars. Some of them are the traditional cold wars and hot wars. Cold wars to prevent hot wars from happening. Europe is going to spend more on defense. The Middle East, Asia, US, China, Japan, India, Korea, to protect against threats. So either to protect from cold wars becoming hot wars, or if there is real hot wars like in Russia, Ukraine, then of course there'll be massive military spending. But that's only one of the 5 wars. We're going to have to fight a war against global climate change. It's going to be very expensive. We're going to have to fight a war to prevent the next global pandemics. So either we spend a lot of money to prevent it, or like in COVID, if we don't prevent it, then the fiscal cost is going to be trillions of dollars. We saw it. 4, the combination of robotic automation and still existing globalization, what people call the globotics revolution, implies that whether it's trade or globalization or technology, many jobs are going to be destroyed. So we need to create a bigger social safety net to protect people against these job losses. That's going to be expensive. And finally, there's been such a rise in income and wealth inequality, not only driven by technology or globalization, but also the economic and financial power of elites and a variety of other factors, that again, there is so much inequality that now we have to essentially transfer more money to those who are left behind, because otherwise you'll have really social unrest, first labor unrest, and eventually you can even have civil wars. You know, historically, when equality becomes too much, you have revolutions, like the Chinese or the Bolshevik Revolution were caused by inequality. So if you want to prevent that from happening, again, we'll have to spend more to protect those who are left behind. Now, these 5 wars imply more government spending as a share of GDP, will have some ability to raise more taxes as a share of the GDP, but not as much as the increase in spending for economic and political reasons. So we will have a structural higher budget deficits that either crowd out economic growth or cause a debt crisis, or if we want to avoid that, we'll have to monetize them. So if wars lead to inflation, 5 wars lead to more inflation. And my view is that fighting these 5 wars implies that the inflation is going to be higher. That's why I don't believe we can go back to 2%. Now, I'm not expecting hyperinflation in advanced economies. I'm not even expecting double-digit inflation. I expect that the average inflation rate in advanced economy goes from 2 to 6%. May not sound a lot, but that 6% 10-year treasury yields have to be at least 6 plus 2, right? 6 for inflation and 2 real rates, 8. Last year, bond yield went from 1 to 3.5, and bond prices fell 20% because there is an inverse relation between the yield and the price. So you lost more money on safe government bonds last year, 20%, than you lost on the S&P 500 that lost only 15%. If bond yields were to go from 3.5 to 8, you'll have another 50% loss in the value of those bonds. And today there are about $20 trillion of dollar-related bonds, either of the public sector or spreads relative to debt, high yield, high grade, emerging market, and so on. And therefore, you have, tens of trillions of assets that are supposed to be safe, right? People say 60-40, put 60 in equity, 40 in bonds because bonds are safer. the price of bonds usually is negatively correlated with the price of equity. Risk on, risk off, growth and recession. That assumes that inflation is low. When inflation is high, equity prices fall like last year because the discount factor for the dividends, the long rate is higher, but the higher long rate implies that price of the bonds is lower. So you lose money in your equity, you lose money in your bonds. So last year, for the first time in decades, 60-40 portfolio lost about 15%. So they were nowhere to hide. Not private equity, nor public equity, not bonds, not credit, nothing. Not growth stocks, not VC, not tech. Actually, long duration assets that are tech stocks lost more money. Nasdaq lost 30%, S&P 15%, because long duration assets by definition are more sensitive to rise in long rates. So that it has also financial implication, this world of higher inflation. And I speak about average inflation of 6. So we're not talking about a doomsday scenario of hyperinflation. Even with 6% inflation, you then have an economic and financial disaster.
중앙은행가들이 바보도 아니고 그렇다고 해서 어떤 그 무능하지도 않고 그걸
네. 말하는
게 아니다. 단지 그들이 처한 상황이 엄청난 부채에 덫에 걸려 있기 때문에 인플레이션 파이팅이 그렇게 쉽게 성공하기 힘들 것이다.
돈 푸는 거 말고는 답이 없는 상황에서
그렇죠.
돈이 풀려서 생기는 부작용으로 고민을 하니
예.
이거 어떻게 하겠어요, 그거를. 참.
그러면은 우리 이제 중요한 것은 실물로 만들어내진 제품과 서비스를 제어와 서비스를 폭발적으로 늘리는 수밖에 없는데.
그러니까 이제 저성장은 그래서 뭔가 이제 혁신으로 극복을 해야 되는 건데 이론적으로는. 근데 그 혁신이라는 게 어디서 뭐 뚝 떨어지는 것도 아니고 참 어렵기 때문에.
그렇죠. 오랜 시간 쌓였다가
네.
갑자기 딱 드러나는 우리 인터넷이 몇십 년 동안 연구 개발 통해서 90년대 후반에 www로 딱 이렇게 어떤 뭐랄까 우리 눈에 확 들어왔지 않습니까? 그 이면에 오랜 기간 동안 한 20여 년 이상을 사실은
그랬었는데.
연구 있었죠.
그래서 이제 혁신이 나올 때까지 그냥 얼어 죽을 수는 없으니까 조금씩 돈을 풀어가면서 버티는 건데
예.
그게 이제 코로나 때문에 한꺼번에 훅 풀리다 보니까
예.
예상하지 못했던 결과들이 막 나오고 있죠.
예.
그런 것 같아서 걱정입니다. 자, 인터뷰는 일단 여기서 마무리하고 저희가 자주 이러지는 않는데 다음 2편으로 이어가서 인터뷰를 계속
잠시 브레이크를 좀 갖고 우리 루빈 교수에게 잠시 브레이크 타임을 주기로 하겠습니다.
예, 바로 2편으로 이어가겠습니다.